So I wanted to start off by saying a little bit, my paper is entitled Ties That Bind and Ties That Free. I wanted to say a little bit from the Buddhist perspective. I do wear two very, very different hats historically, as a Buddhist scholar, as a Buddhist teacher, three hats actually, and as a psychotherapist. So as a Buddhist teacher and scholar, I wanted to say something about the use of attachment in Buddhist context, because the use of attachment is kind of a confusing word when we look at it in Buddhism and in psychotherapy. In Buddhism, if you really look at translationese, the place that attachment shows up a lot is in the translation of the 12 links of dependent origination. And interestingly enough, the key teaching there is we have feelings, and in Buddhism, feelings, again, the words don't have the same meanings as in English. Feelings are either neutral, pleasant, or painful. So we have a sense experience or a mental experience. We have a feeling. That's all more or less due to karmic experience. But then we have a reaction, and then the teachings, the reactions that are very, very problematic are two. One is called in Pali, it's tanha, in Sanskrit Trishna, and Tibetan sepa, which means thirst, literally. It's a cognate of thirst. Trishna is sounds like thirst, right? And the second one that's built on thirst is upadana. And upadana is the real culprit for the development of samsara, at least in the way that the Theravada depiction of this all occurs. And that's the same in Sanskrit, but in Tibetan it's nye or limba. So with Trishna and upadana in particular, you're creating karma. Turns out some people who saw the word Trishna didn't like the word thirst, and they translated that as attachment. Some people saw upadana, maybe clinging would be a better or more general translation, but you can find people who use attachment for the translation of upadana as well. So attachment is a nasty in Buddhist English translation. And if you look at I call it the Bible of Theravada Buddhist psychology, is the path of purification. But the other Bible is a book called the Abhidhamma Sangaha, the Compendium of Abhidharma. But in the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, Buddhaghosa gives a metaphor for what attachment is, and it's so vivid you'll never forget it. And it describes an attitude of mind, and he says it's like putting raw meat on a hot skillet. That's the kind of stick that you get when you have this kind of thirst or clinging. So that's something that people who are taking up Buddhist practice are trying to modulate and moderate. And so attachment in Buddhist translation English is a negative word. And so we're just aware of that. And then when we're going to shift over to the psychotherapeutic world, attachment's going to have a different connotation. And that's where I would like to go now. To the 1950s, there's a war going on in the psychoanalytic community in England between the people who follow Melanie Klein and the people who follow Anna Freud. And we're not going to get into the details, but it's enlightening to understand that people who are trying to solve other people's problems had a heck of a lot of problems themselves. Enter John Bowlby, and he's kind of a third force who everybody decided to hate. And he was unusual because he actually looked at real children. And strange to say, Melanie Klein was looking at real children, but I'm not sure what she was seeing. But John Bowlby actually looked at real children, and he looked at primates as well. And he saw a kind of connection between primate behavior and child behavior. And he did things like, he had a buddy who made films of children in hospitals, and he actually started looking at what was the nature of the relationship of children to their parents in terms of the seeking safety and closeness and security in bonding. And this was called attachment. I don't remember the citation that I saw, but when I was really looking into attachment theory for writing my book, somewhere I ran across some theorists said we could have used love, but attachment sounded more sort of scientific. I think, I had a little debate with Anne about this, but I think that what's being described as attachment theory, namely the whole set of behaviors between parents, most notably mothers, but also fathers, and infants in terms of seeking closeness and security, can be either understood as attachment or love. But in the psychological literature, attachment is the word we use. And the great thing that's occurred is that Bowlby really was sort of rejected initially, and bless his soul, he sort of hung in there. And what's occurred is a kind of interesting thing that really for many, many years, psychoanalysts were not empiricists. Aside from looking at what was going on in their office, they did look at the empirical reality of what was happening in the office. But Bowlby and then people who followed in his stead, following him, Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, really were psychologists who took study of child and parent relationships into the laboratory, and there's then developed this kind of dialogue between clinical psychologists, experimental psychologists, psychoanalysts, where they're actually looking at data, and everybody's looking at the same data. And my folk hero in this particular world is a guy named Peter Fonagy, who shuttles between Euston and London. But he's a great clinician, he's a great psychoanalyst, but he also looks at reams of data and test material. So the field of psychoanalysis, as far as I'm concerned, is going through a renaissance where they're actually using data-driven material to improve their practices. So one of the things that they say about attachment when it occurs is that having a solid attachment, a secure attachment, one of the things that's going on is we create images in our minds of our parents, and these are called working models or mental representations. In the world of attachment, they're called working models. In the prior psychoanalytic world, they were called object representations. But one of the things about the working models, and this is a quote from Mary Main, is they not only include images of our parents, but they also affect how we process life. And so these register in the infant as mental representations and rules for processing information that influence in turn how freely the older child, adolescent, and adult is able to think, feel, remember, and act. Now this is really, really critical, and it's sort of, it's where all the kind of hay is being made nowadays, I think, in psychoanalytic thinking, and that is what happens to us when we're really young really influences the way we think and feel. And, I was an academic, and, so if you're hanging out in academia and you're talking to people about thoughts and reason all the time, it's a little bit hard to appreciate how people may not think or feel in a way that's really optimal for themselves. But really in life, and certainly sitting in a clinician's chair, every day I talk to people who say, I want to go over there, and my behavior takes me over here. I don't want to be beaten up, and I know my husband is violent. I'm going back home tonight, and I'm buying a bottle of alcohol for my husband. So this is very, very puzzling how that works, but it happens day in and day out in clinical practice. And this is a kind of result of what has happened in childhood. Certain things can't be thought about in a way that's productive for people. Mary Main went on to say a further sort of fine-tuning of what I said before is that these sort of working models are a set of conscious or unconscious principles for organizing information related to attachment that direct not only feelings and behavior, but also attention, memory, and cognition. So for all people who are talking about mindfulness and attention and cognition, one of the rubs in all of this is that depending on how we were raised, it's going to affect how people practice. And we just talked with a colleague from Denmark, and he's got some Mind Life money to do some very, very careful studies of what people actually do when they meditate. And one of the things that I think I've run across is when I talk with some of my clients who meditate is that somebody says, well, I meditate in the morning. Well, you make a very, very bad assumption if you think you know what they're talking about. And unless you ask them exactly, what do you do? Ann and I had an experience where we taught a retreat once, and we actually were, sort of doing some feedback at the end, and we were just saying, well, how's your meditation going? Oh, very, very good. Okay, so what was happening? Well, I left my body and I was observing space from above sort of the ceiling. Now, this is a classic kind of description of dissociative behavior. It's not what most Buddhist meditative practices are supposed to achieve. We wouldn't have known that if we didn't ask. And, you really need to inquire. And I think anybody who teaches meditation in this room, or is a clinician working with people who are doing mindfulness or any other sort of meditation, there's a lot of hay to be made in actually asking people, what are you really doing? And how do you feel about yourself as you're doing it? Because a lot of people are meditating, but basically what they're doing is they're beating themselves up. Saying, I'm not a good person, I've got to be a better person, this is what I'm doing, I'm meditating on my breath. And you just get tight listening to them. So I think Mary Main's idea of this working models that direct not only feelings and behavior, but also attention, memory, and cognition is very, very central. So Mary Main and Peter Fonagy have further elaborated that security of attachment, resilience, and the ability to raise children are all correlated with the individual's capacity to adopt a reflective stance towards experience. So now things get a little bit more interesting. So when we can reflect upon our feelings and our thoughts, not only on our own, but other people's experience, this is related to a capacity to raise secure children. And he calls this skill, it's a terrible word, but we're sort of stuck with it. There are two versions of this. Fonagy and his cohort call it mentalizing. Daniel Siegel and his cohort call it mindsight. Neither of them are great, and it's hard. If you just use sort of self-reflection, it's not quite enough. But it's very, very interesting. Parents with a strong reflective capacity are shown to be 3 to 4 more times likely to have secure children. So how reflective a parent is going to be directly related to how secure a child feels. And that, in turn, will be reflected in the child's greater flexibility in attention, memory, and cognition. So it turns out in the Western, if in Buddhism attachment were ties that bind, in the Western context, attachment is something that actually allows you to be free, flexible, and really capable. There are studies, I think they're as young as 1.5 years to 2 years old, children who have been tested in terms of their style of attachment. Those who are secure are able to sit alone and be comfortable much longer in measurable, directly measurable ways than children who are not identified as securely attached at an early age. So if you've gotten like good stuff from a parent at a young age, it allows you just to be stable and calm going throughout your life. If you haven't, you're more challenged. Interestingly enough, for example, they took one of their sort of tests, they were deprived mothers, but who had strong reflective capacities. They raised secure children, whereas those who did not have reflective capacities, only 1 in 17 was able to raise a secure child. So even if you have a kind of challenged background, if you're able to reflect, and that means both on your cognition and your feelings, you really have a chance of raising a secure child. So Fonagy says, interestingly enough, that being able to do this kind of thing is actually critical for survival. To quote, "This representational system is a mentalizing system that offers the enormous evolutionary survival advantage of enabling individuals to understand, interpret, and predict the behavior of others as well as their own behavior. As such, it is a cornerstone of social intelligence and critical to work, play, and collaboration of all kinds." So what we work with in psychotherapy, and I love this book by David Wallen, it's called Attachment in Psychotherapy. For my money, it's sort of like the one-volume introduction to attachment theory and mindfulness use in psychotherapy in the 21st century. Wallen states that pretty much any psychopathology that we deal with is an inhibition of mentalizing. And that psychotherapy can understood to rekindle or restore or kindle the patient's capacity to mentalize within a secure base. So in that instance, we can look at it and say the psychotherapist, in a way, is the kind of independent variable. Hopefully they're somewhat secure. The client is the dependent variable, and they are developing the ability to mentalize based on the psychotherapeutic interaction. Absent a sort of secure attachment history, individuals may be very, very brittle. They may be very, very resistant to new information. And again, those of you who don't have the privilege of working with people and trying to help them, it is actually a privilege. It's hard to imagine how sometimes brittle people can be in terms of the worldview they hold or the patterns that, and I should say we, because I'm included as a client, that we can hold on to when, we get stuck. We get stuck in things. Wallen says, and as a paraphrase, in the grip of an absence of mentalizing, individuals can't think anything they don't already believe. They're unable to imagine feelings other than what they're currently feeling, and they're unable to consider actions other than already decided upon. What mentalizing allows us to do is to really look at our motivations, feelings behind our behaviors. And what's really necessary here, and this is an interesting area for maybe some further conversations, is that it needs to be a reflection on what we're actually feeling, not just thoughts. Absent that, it would be pseudo-mentalizing. So one of, I think, the interesting questions that I would engage with Brendan about would be, in therapy, we want somebody to have actually their feelings, but actually then engage in a conversation, a reflective conversation about those feelings. And I'd be interested to hear where people are going with the CBCT that you were talking about, whether it's like, oops, this feeling is arising. Is it a kind of immediate kind of trying to turn away, or is there a holding for that feeling? It's just an interesting area of conversation and comparison. So one of the reasons I'm so eager to push therapy or conversations about therapy is that I had a lot of personal history in meditation with Goenka's meditation, as a matter of fact, and ended up with a lot of personal difficulty, panic attacks to be exact. And so that was startling to me, and I had to get into therapy, which was also a very startling endeavor for me. It was so startling, and I was so amazed that I decided to become a therapist, because when I walked into therapy, everything was fine. And even within a 10-session short-term therapy, first exposure to therapy, I started realizing that a lot of things that I thought were fine were not fine. And it really was within the relational context of therapy that my defenses were confronted. And so one of the big axes, I guess, I have to grind with everything that's typically said about most of these cognitive interventions is that they're really not talking about the relationship with the key person, which I think, first of all, is a very, very big variable in terms of that there is a relationship. You know, in traditional practice, we're usually sent off and we're on our own for weeks and months. So the fact that these are actually psychoeducational and there's usually a leader is very, very important. But in my own experience, I could have meditated till I was blue in my face. I still would not have recognized the things I needed to recognize because somebody was asking me very, very pointed questions. And so that is a plug for psychodynamic psychotherapy. I'm sorry. But I'm not affiliated with any commercial ventures. Let's see. So it turns out that mindfulness, Wallen is citing Daniel Siegel, and he thinks that mindfulness can actually contribute to a felt sense of security. The regular exercise of mindful awareness seems to promote the same benefits, bodily and affective self-regulation, attuned communication with others, insight, empathy, and the like, that research has found to be associated with childhood histories of secure attachment. Although there may be other explanation for these parallel outcomes, I would suggest that they arise from the fact that mindfulness and secure attachment alike are capable of generating through very different routes the same invaluable psychological resource, namely the internalized secure base. So this is saying something very, very important, and it raised the very, very interesting question that I'm not remembering, Anna Maria back there. You know, it turns out that in terms of self-regulation, there are actually social self-regulation mechanisms and self-regulation mechanisms. And so this is saying that at least in terms of mindfulness, there is a self-regulation mechanism that's at work that can create a secure base that's very, very important. I want to, because you raised a very, very important question, Anna Maria, I want to try to jump to address it a little bit, just a little bit, but I want to say some things that nobody else has dared say. And that is, you know, Blake, in terms of mindfulness, Blake said if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. It would be my contention that mindfulness actually is a door of perception scrubber. And just very, very quickly, Daniel Siegel's got a great little piece about perception. Perception, let's say, of a flower occurs in the neocortex, and it starts in the lowest level, 5 to 6, and it starts moving up, but there's also a stream moving down from the top layers, from the bottom layers. They meet in the segments 3 and 4. But what happens is that when you see a flower, you try to save a lot of energy. You have an expectational bias about seeing the flower. And your mind is basically saying, another marigold. And so we go through life, all of us are adults, and basically our whole experience is mostly another marigold. Another person, another professor, you know, another lecture, and it's kind of boring and dead. And Siegel hypothesizes that through the process of mindfulness, we can actually start getting closer to the bare perception of what that flower is within the Buddhist context. There's a whole school of tenets called the Sautrantika, which sort of detail this kind of difference between indirect perception and direct perception. But I think anybody who's done any mindfulness themselves has the firsthand experience of as Siegel says, the ordinary becoming extraordinary. So then enter, stage left, Daniel Stern, who unfortunately died recently. He's got a wonderful book called The Present Moment, not a mention of Asia in it. It's completely out of sort of the Western psychological and tradition. And Stern looks at really the human ballet that occurs between individuals, therapists and clients, beloveds, friends. And he talks about really moments of encounter, which are really occurring when this freshness is at play. One way he has of characterizing it is he says, I know that you know that I know. So it's that kind of intuitive attunement that people can feel when they have very, very fresh perception. He calls it a moment of meeting, or he also calls it an intersubjective consciousness. I might also call it a moment of grace. And so I know this is an academic conference, and it's almost, to me, being a sort of a professional religious, the elephant that's under the carpet in the meeting is that there is actually a religious sentiment that is associated with mindfulness. And sort of all of the people wearing their medical scrubs are sort of like keeping it pure and anesthetic. And nobody wants to say this is like the greatest thing that I ever experienced. I actually feel alive. So, you know, there is a kind of mysterium fascinans in the world of, you know, study of religion, the fascinating mystery associated with that which is ultimately real. And I think that, again, anybody who's done a fair bit of meditation starts getting in touch with that fascinating mystery. And I think that when we are meditating, we actually have the capacity for a relationship which is quite other than our normal relationships, and something very, very sacred occurs in those relationships, and something very, very healing can occur in those relationships. And the reason that we as therapists are attracted to it for ourselves as therapists and want our clients to participate in it is that something both healing, helpful, but also sacred can occur. And I would like to close with a short reading from Buber, because in a way he's contrasting the instrumental world of scientific research and the world of religion and spirituality, which for him is put in the phrase of I, thou. But in some ways, I think that, again, this is the elephant that's under the carpet that we've all been afraid to mention, because we are scientists and we are professors and we're in a medical institution. But, you know, I think at the same time, everybody's saying, God, isn't this stuff great? So this is his contrast between the I-it world and the I-thou world. To a man, the world is twofold in accordance with his twofold attitude. He perceives what exists round him, simply things and beings as things, and what happens round him, simply events and actions as event, an ordered and detached world. But you cannot meet others in it. You cannot hold on to life without it. Its reliability sustains you, but should you die in it, your grave would be nothingness. Or on the other hand, man meets what exists and becomes as what it is over against him, always simply a single being, and each thing simply as being. Nothing is present for him except that one thing, but it implicates the whole world. Measure and comparison have disappeared. The world which appears to you in this way is unreliable, for it takes on a continually new appearance. You cannot hold it to its word. It comes even when it is not summoned and vanishes even when it is tightly held. It is not outside you, it stirs in you, it stirs in the depth of you. If you say, soul of my soul, you have not said too much. It is your present. Only while you have it do you have the present. Between you and it there is mutual giving. You say thou to it and give yourself to it. It says thou to you and gives itself to you. Through the graciousness of its comings and the solemn sadness of its going, it leads you away to the thou, in which the parallel lines of relations meet. It does not help to sustain you in life. It only helps you to glimpse eternity. Thank you all.